In March '84, there was the first fatality, and adjutant chef Philippe Mariotti of the French mission was killed in a horrendous, targeted assassination.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. BRIXMIS and its operations behind enemy lines continues to fascinate the listeners of Cold War Conversations. In August of 2024, I was honoured to be invited to the National Army Museum in London to interview Andrew Long, the author of BRIXMIS and the Secret Cold War, Intelligence Collecting Operations Behind Enemy Lines in East Germany. The National Army Museum is the leading authority on the British Army and its impact on society past and present. It's well worth a visit, and particularly their Foe to Friend exhibition about the British Army in Germany since 1945, which is on until the end of September 2024. In front of a sellout audience, including approximately 50 BRIXMIS veterans and their families, we discuss the role, purpose and achievements of BRIXMIS. The accompanying presentation can be viewed in the episode notes. The interview starts with an introduction from former BRIXMIS officer Major General Peter Williams and Chairman of the BRIXMIS Association. I'm delighted to welcome Peter Williams, Andrew Long and a sellout audience at the National Army Museum to our Cold War conversation.
I always feel a bit like a superannuated karaoke singer with a microphone like this, but I'll do the best I can. And just to make the point at the beginning, this may be the National Army Museum, but BRIXMIS was about more than just the Army. So for the Air Force people who are feeling a little crinkled already, don't worry, we do love you after all. Thank you, Danny, for your introduction and for you and your team working so hard to make this happen. And on behalf of the BRIXMIS Association Committee, I want to start by congratulating Andrew, the author of this remarkable book about the mission that is being launched today. And I'd like to welcome Ian Sanders as well, over my right shoulder, of the Cold War Conversations podcast site. They'll both discuss the book and its genesis once I'm done. I'd also like to say how delighted we are to be joined by our own president, General John Foley, here in the front, and his wife Anne. General John was the chief of BRIXMIS in the late 1980s. Also with us today, a number of veterans of the mission from every decade of its existence except the 1940s, along with numerous family members of BRIXMIS veterans, reminding us just how vital their support was, not just back in the day, but also continues to be today. And we're particularly chuffed to be joined by Warrant Officer Harry Puttick from the Royal Hospital Chelsea next door. Harry served as a member of the mission back in the early 1970s. The ethos of the mission was, and remains, that of a family, working together through teamwork to deliver excellent results. And although what it was that BRIXMIS did was very much need to know during the Cold War, after the wall fell, the media's attention shifted to other potential theatres of war. And it was at that stage that the BRIXMIS Association sought to ensure that the mission's achievements were not forgotten. Our aim was to move from need to know to ought to know. The an in-house history, the story of BRIXMIS, was produced back in 1993, and then in the mid-1990s, 2 books were published that brought the public's attention to the mission, more often than not for the first time. The first was Beyond the Front Line, written by Tony Geraghty, with support from BRIXMIS veterans and some grudging support from the Ministry of Defence, and it covered more than 4 decades of the mission's existence. And the second book, The Last Mission, Behind the Iron Curtain by Steve Gibson, who was written by a man who had served as a young tour officer in BRIXMIS in the late 1980s. Several years later, the BRIXMIS Association's committee decided that as part of the legacy that the mission deserved to have, a memorial should be erected at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. And so it was that in 2016, the BRIXMIS Association Memorial was unveiled at a ceremony marking the 70th anniversary of the mission's founding back in September 1946. With 2 books and a project for a fine memorial in place, We, the members of the Associations Committee, also set about creating an archive that could contain all the available surviving information about BRIXMIS and its fellow American and French military liaison missions. A decade and a half of unrelenting work by the Association's archivist, Squadron Leader Rod Saar, who's here with us today, has resulted in a collection of over 1,200 folders in 26 archive boxes. And it consists of memoirs, British and American official reports, maps and photographs, plus numerous reports from the East German secret police, the Stasi. And this extraordinary collection has been entrusted to the Little Hart Centre for Military Archives at King's College London, and it's already been of great use to academic researchers as well as to authors, and not least to Andrew here
Indeed.
today. Our collective and heartfelt thanks go to Rod Saar, and they cannot be overemphasised. Still underway is the final part of the BRIXMIS Association's unstinting efforts to ensure that the mission's achievements, both military, diplomatic and operational, are not forgotten. And in response to the government's review in 2012 of historic medal awards, the BRIXMIS Association has been involved in a lengthy bureaucratic battle with the political elite in Whitehall to gain medallic recognition for everyone who served in the mission during its 44 years of operational existence as an intelligence collection unit. We operated unarmed in a theatre, East Germany, where the opposition was well armed and all too eager to react violently. That only 2 members of the 3 Western military liaison missions were killed by hostile action during more than 4 decades of aggressive patrolling was more a tribute to our collective professionalism than the result of any absence of danger. We have already made 3 submissions to the government in the last 7 years, seeking a BRIXMIS bar to the General Service Medal for all who served in the mission. And we will launch a 4th attempt early in 2025 in the belief that our achievements more than exceeded Whitehall's subjective and nebulous risk and rigour standards. However, we're not here to explain what makes the members of the BRIXMIS Association committee tick. We're here to applaud Andrew for his long and diligent research, much of it in the BRIXMIS archive at King's College, and for the excellent book that he is launching today. Brings the reader up to date with the latest available information about BRIXMIS and, where appropriate, about its counterpart American and French military liaison missions. Andrew jumped through countless hoops in order to ensure that his final product is as accurate as possible. Rod Saar and I, who were invited to review and comment on it at the draft stage, are confident that readers will gain from it a real sense of what it was like to serve in that most remarkable of Cold War organisations. It is, as I said at the beginning, a story that was once a deep, dark secret, in every sense, need to know. And now, for Cold War enthusiasts, it has become a tale that is very much ought to know. And I can wholeheartedly recommend it to you. Again, many congratulations, Andrew. Over to you.
Thank you.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for that introduction. And I think it's safe to say that both Andrew and myself are humbled by the number of BRIXMIS veterans that are here today and their families. And we pay tribute to your service during the Cold War. The book itself, Andrew and I are going to be digging into some of the detail today. I know we have a tough audience here if we get anything wrong. That's why we got rid of the Q&A.
Yep.
But my first question for Andrew today is, what makes this book different to the other BRIXMIS books that have previously been released on the subject?
Thanks, Ian. I probably should actually introduce Ian as well. So Ian runs this extraordinary podcast called Cold War Conversations, available on all good podcasting platforms. Ian has some extraordinary guests that were part of this Cold War story. So look out for it. You can see it on Spotify and all that sort of stuff. It's my favourite podcast. So it's great to actually be on the podcast as well. So that's great.
And I'll be looking for interviewees later.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Watch yourselves.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so in answer to Ian's question, I think Peter sort of stole my thunder to a certain degree, or preempted it, because basically what has become around, Tony Geraghty and Steve Gibson, they broke ground that introduced the mission to the world that had never heard of BRIXMIS. And so back in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, that the books caused quite a stir. There was a lot of interest then, but over time the sort of buzz has subsided. What's happened in the meantime, as Peter said, Rod's built this extraordinary archive at King's College, which I spent days, happy days, going through those 26 boxes, every single file, believe you me. And as well as building the archive, these gents gave us access to a lot of great people, some people in the room today, which is very exciting. I can't tell you how good it is to meet some of these people that I've been writing about for the last 2 or 3 years. So not only have we spoken to, well, I've spoken to veterans with Rod's archive, there's also a very good archive here at the National Army Museum. And you'll see in a minute one of the items that I picked up in the archive that the BRIXMIS Association guys hadn't seen before. So, there's new information coming up all the time. The other thing is the National Archives are declassifying material on a rolling basis, so we can get access to that, which is great. And also the Stasi archives in Berlin. I know a lot of people have looked up their own archives to see what nonsense the Stasi recorded about them, but that information is actually very useful, and you'll see some pictures as we go through. I think the only other difference really is I take a very visual approach to my writing. So the book's packed with maps and diagrams because it's the way I think, and I think it helps the reader get a feeling for what was going on. So you'll see some of them there. There you are. Brief answer to a long answer to a brief
Perfect.
question.
No, great. So many in the audience are going to be familiar with the setting for today's talk, but I just want to provide a little bit of context. So as Andrew said, this is a great example of the quality of the maps that are within the book, but this shows that post-war Germany was split into 4 occupation zones: the British, French, American, which became the Federal Republic of Germany, and the Soviet, which became the German Democratic Republic, or better known as East Germany. Berlin was 100 miles or so inside the Soviet zone and also split into 4 sectors. It was split in 2 by the Berlin Wall in 1961, creating West Berlin and East Berlin. And the only access to West Berlin from West Germany was specific road corridors, railway lines, river connections, and 3 air corridors. Berlin airspace was controlled within the Berlin Control Zone, which was a circle covering all of Greater Berlin, and we'll be covering more of this later. So, Andrew, what is BRIXMIS?
Yeah, I suppose it's important to confirm that right at the outset. So it's the British Commanders-in-Chief mission to the Soviet forces of occupation in Germany. And thankfully, they abbreviated that to BRIXMIS. To those who served, it was known as the mission.
So how did it come about and what was its purpose?
Okay. Back in September 1946, an agreement was signed, although we don't know if they actually put pen to paper, but an agreement was created between the Soviet occupation forces in Germany and the British. They realised that in the sort of heady days of the immediate post-war, they needed to identify formal communication channels or liaison channels, and that's a very important word, to facilitate the peaceful coexistence between the British occupation zone and the Soviet zone. So, it was a very important part of just establishing the peace.
Yeah, so this was really important as an ally became foe as the Cold War started.
Absolutely. So Lieutenant General Sir Brian Robertson, he was the Deputy Military Governor of the British Zone, and Colonel General Mikhail Malinin, he was the deputy chief of staff of the Soviet forces in Germany. They put their name to the agreement, and it's the Robertson-Malinin Agreement, and thankfully that's known as the RMA. So we've got BRIXMIS being created by the RMA. We're going to refer you to the screen quite a lot. So on the left there is a copy of the the BRIXMIS agreement, the RMA, that's from this very museum. The point of the mission, or the point of the agreement, was to formalise military liaison. Again, I use that word again. And they created reciprocal missions in each other's territory. You can see a young captain there who went on to great things. That is the BRIXMIS Pass. Now, that was an extraordinarily important document. That's Peter Williams, sorry, by the way, if you can't read Cyrillic script. The pass was essential because it gave the bearer access to East Germany. Next to it is the vehicle pass. So as well as each of the individual members of BRIXMIS having a pass, each vehicle had its own pass as well. And you'll see a BRIXMIS high visibility number plate at the bottom there.
And that can be seen on the Senator upstairs in the Frente-Faux exhibition, although it's not strictly accurate.
Before somebody makes a comment on that, thank you, Dave. So the Americans and the French, they signed similar agreements with the Soviets the following year, creating the US mission and the French mission. And then equally, the reciprocal Soviet military liaison mission was known as SOXMIS, and they were based right in the middle of BAOR in West Germany, and they did a similar but not quite the same role.
And for those interested in SOXMIS, Cold War Conversations has an episode with a member of the Royal Military Police who was tracking SOXMIS during the Cold War. It's episode 241. So, Andrew, where did all this liaison take place?
Right. So, the mission had a formal headquarters, which was known as the Mission House, and that was located from 1958 on Seestrasse in Potsdam, which of course was inside the German Democratic Republic. The Mission House, you can see there on the two photos on the left, it was a grand villa primarily for entertaining and protocol purpose, but it was also a stopping off point for people embarking on tours, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The house had these fantastic gardens leading down to a lake, so it was quite a nice place for mission members and their family to spend on a social point of view, but of course it had a formal role as well. There was a chap a live-in mission house warrant officer, and I think we talked about our friend at the back there, and their role was basically to run the operation. What they did have, though, was the staff were all East German.
I can't imagine they were trusted in any way.
No. We know now, following the fall of the Berlin Wall, that they were all Stasi or KGB informants. And it was generally assumed they were, but we found out for certain with the Stasi archives opening up. It was also never proven, but it was believed that the mission house was bugged electronically, because of course the Soviets refurbished it, so they had an ample opportunity to do their thing. So basically there were protocols in place with the mission people to only talk in certain places or not to talk shop in the public rooms.
And what about the BRIXMIS presence in West Berlin?
Well, their rear HQ was the administrative side of the mission. It's the sort of the beating heart of the operation, and that was at the Olympic Stadium complex in West Berlin.
Right. And how did they cross then from West Berlin into East Berlin? Where was the crossing point for this? Okay, well, we happen to have a photograph on the screen here. That is the Glienicke Bridge, and that's the crossing point from actually the American sector of Berlin into the GDR. You see the top one there, it's photographed from a BRIXMIS chipmunk. Yeah, this is the famous Bridge of Spies, but the East Germans called it the Bridge of Unity. Yeah, somewhat ironic for the communists.
Yeah, they did have a habit of saying the exact opposite of what they meant, but that's East Germans for you.
The Bridge of Spies is a subject I've covered a lot in Cold War Conversations, so feel free to browse. there. Spy swaps are very much in the news now, and the Glienicke Bridge was used extensively for that.
Exactly. You had the famous one with Rudolf Abel and Francis Gary Powers, and there was sort of several ones. The last exchange was a human rights guy in the mid-late 80s, but
Sharansky, I think,
yeah. So, yeah, it's very much a happening at the moment.
But BRIXMIS had an easier route across there.
They did. They had to cross the bridge, and they ran the gauntlet of the Soviet checkpoint. So there was a ritual of presenting the pass. So we showed you the pass earlier. The passes for the people and the vehicle were submitted to the Soviets, who noted everything down, gave the information to the Stasi, who then basically used it as a prompt to follow the missions in East Germany. The bridge itself, you can see in the photos there, these are shot from the east, and you won't have seen many photos like this. They were taken by a friend of mine who was in the US Army Band in West Berlin, and he took them from the tour bus going back from a gig at the US Potsdam Mission House. And he certainly shouldn't have been taking pictures, but he did. So thankfully, I've been able to get them. But you can see the checkpoint, the barriers and controls. They were very intense checkpoints. They changed over the years from lift-up barriers to massive great concrete blocks, and I'm sure there were all sorts of nasties as well in the background. And then thankfully, if you look at the picture on the right, there was a BRIXMIS senator coming in the opposite direction. That was rather handy, wasn't it? So anyway, so that's the Glienicke Bridge.
I can see many nodding heads there, bringing back some memories for some of our audience here. So, Andrew, you've mentioned quite a lot liaison. What form did this liaison take?
Right. The main liaison purpose was raising and escalating protests and issues, sorting out issues between the Soviets and the British. Fundamentally, it was the only point of contact between the British and the Soviets. So if there was anything happened in either country, it was BRIXMIS that was the crossover between the two massive armies. The BRIXMIS counterparts in Potsdam were called SERB, S-E-R-B, the Soviet External Relations Branch. They were almost certainly GRU officers and probably one or two KGB as well, but they were the day-to-day interface between the mission and their sort of Soviet hosts. As well as that sort of escalation of problems, there was a lot of formal and informal socialising and entertaining. Only with the Soviets, didn't have anything to do with the East Germans, because of course, from a military point of view, or even a diplomatic point of view, that they didn't recognise East Germany for quite a few years. There were formal occasions. The Queen's Birthday Parade was probably the hottest ticket in town. There were massive parades in the Olympic Stadium, and then a reception back at the Mission House, which was the hot ticket. As well as that, there was a lot of informal socialising with the Serb colleagues at the Mission House, and you can see some various antics going on there. I must admit, I love that photo of that Soviet guy there. It's straight out of central casting for a Bond villain. It's wonderful. And I don't know what they made of kilts. I imagine that was quite an interesting thing for them. But that was very important. That establishing those sort of social relationships became very important when there was a problem in the field, with a tour, because these people would be brought in to basically sort out. So if you were buddies with them, vodka and whiskey buddies, you still had that chance that they would, be able to try and sort it out just that little bit easier.
Yeah, it's one of the fascinating things I find. Well, there's so many fascinating things about BRIXMIS for me, but socialising with sworn enemies is quite a paradox there. Now, based on what you've described here, some might view this as champagne soldiering. Absolutely not. Anything but. So I've told you the purpose of the entertaining. It was to establish relationships. But very soon after the mission was formed, it evolved into an intelligence collection operation, and that developed to become a very effective intelligence machine, if you like. Continued uninterrupted, 24/7, 365 days a year, right from the agreement being signed in September 1946 until the mission was closed in 1990. So that's 44 years of operation, pretty much uninterrupted. And what form did this intelligence collection take? How was it organised?
Okay, you'll hear the word Tor mentioned a lot. Basically, the Tor was dispatched into East Germany to observe, to record the activities of the Soviet and the East German militaries. You had a ground Tor. That was initially an army focus. They were looking at the Soviet ground Orbat, the order of battle, command and control, troop formations, movements, training and exercises, and fundamentally equipment. So they were looking at tanks, armoured personnel carriers, trucks, amphibious operations. Amphibious operations were very important because as the expected Soviets were rampaging across West Germany, they would have to cross a succession of rivers. So the Soviets practiced amphibious crossings a lot, and there's some cracking stories of that. The Soviets would be observed at barracks, training areas, these things called TAC routes, and you'll see one in a minute, which were cross-country routes for armoured vehicles, crisscross the whole of East Germany, so tanks could zoom towards their objectives quite quickly. And of course, they had to get all this kit in and out of the country, so that was another thing that the mission looked at. And then there was the air tour. So you had primarily an RAF focus there, and they were, of course, looking at aircraft, helicopters, air defence systems, that was a big part, and the associated radar, so we're talking surface-to-air missiles. And so airfields were their primary objective, but also there was a lot of sneaking around in bushes at the outer edges of missile batteries and various exploits that certain people got up to. So those were the primary tours.
So I understand what BRIXMIS is looking for there, but how did they actually perform these tours?
So a tour was a team of 3 dispatched in a high-performance, heavily modified vehicle. The tour officer was in charge of the tour, but he was also in charge of photography. He was normally a Russian linguist and was the primary navigator. And if you see the picture on the top left, you see the tour officer in the back of his car there photographing over the shoulders of his colleagues. Then there was a tour NCO. His primary role was recognition. So he was an expert in Warsaw Pact equipment. So he'd be recording all the information that the tour officer was photographing. And lastly, and you could argue critically to the whole operation, was the tour driver. And these were normally Royal Corps of Transport or RAF, highly skilled drivers responsible for security as well. While the tour officer and NCO were looking at their targets, the tour driver's role was to make sure they weren't being sneaked up upon by nasty people. So you've got a posed photo in the top left of running a column in a G-Wagen, which was the later vehicle. Then we've got a picture of an air tour, and that's Colin Ward leaning on top of the car, and I believe he's tuning in from Uzbekistan at the moment, so hi Colin. And Stan Matthews, I think, is also there looking at the target in the middle of the field with a G-Wagen. Then you've got, which is one of my favourite photos, if you look upstairs in the Photo Friend exhibition, you'll see this saloon car, this executive saloon. This is what they got up to in it.
So this looks more like rally driving than touring.
It's not a gentle drive in the countryside, as the tour drivers in the room will attest to. Yeah, the rally is actually an important point, because when this particular car came along, there were some issues with it, and they actually had to do some work with Opel Motorsport, who were the current World Rally Championships holders at the time. So, yeah, there was actually a very strong link with rallying. The final type of tour, as you can see in the bottom right, was an aerial photographic reconnaissance sortie. Now, these were flown in a de Havilland Chipmunk, a 2-seater training aircraft that was basically every pilot within the RAF would have used this aircraft as part of their training. It was a tandem 2-seater. The observer would normally sit at the front. It would be flown from the back seat, and they'd potter around this Berlin control zone that Ian mentioned, basically looking down on the targets. So it was a really important viewpoint, because there's a limited amount you can see from the road, but you're looking from above, you can actually see what's going on. And they flew down to like 300 feet sometimes. They weren't supposed to, but they did, with the aircraft crabbing along so they could get the angle right. But it was a hugely important and very secret part of the mission operation.
Now, I'm sure I've heard a story somewhere about a chipmunk coming back with a bullet hole in it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's quite a famous story. Only happened the once, as far as I know. April 1975, Squadron Leader Brian Speed was observing. Master Pilot Graham Forrester was the pilot. They potted around, did their thing, returned to Gatow, and the ground crew said, "Excuse me, sir, do you realise there's a huge, great hole in your propeller spinner?" So basically, they somewhat surprised, because I don't think they were aware that they'd been attacked. When the photos were developed the next day, there was a Soviet soldier next to a BMP-1 armoured personnel carrier aiming straight at the Chipmunk. So they've actually got a photograph of their assailant. A couple of feet back, it would have hit the engine, and that would have been it. And there was about 2 minutes dead stick flying, if that. So it was would have been a very serious issue. A couple of feet further back, it would have hit Brian or Graham. So, it was quite a serious issue, and the spinner was removed, and I believe it was in the ops room for many years afterwards.
Now, BRIXMIS were involved in some very dirty work in full meaning of the word. Tell me about Tamarisk and Tomahawk.
Okay. Well, this again, I think, is a favourite story about the mission. And again, was very, very secret. It was basically exploiting intelligence from Soviet rubbish tips. The Soviets were messy, that they just basically didn't really look after the premises that they lived in. It was just habitually messy. So after training or a deployment, or even just throwing trash over the back fence of their barracks, that was an intelligence goldmine. There was also, unfortunately, a rather unsanitary source of intelligence. British soldiers, when they got their daily ration packs, that included toilet paper, as well as rations. And, of course, that worked fine. The Soviets weren't, so they basically had to improvise. And they improvised with whatever they could get their hands on. So torn out newspaper pages, pages torn out of manuals, notebooks, maps even, and that was utilised as we just mentioned. And then it was just chucked over the fence. So the tours would be dispatched, hopefully wearing quite thick glasses and perhaps a peg over the nose, and they'd pick through this rubbish tip and bag it up, double bag it up, take it back to the office where it was dried out, and then interpreted by a special team called Spandau, who were linguists, Russian linguists. And the intelligence was extraordinary, what they picked up. So there was confidential notes that should never have been used written in a notebook in the first place, let alone used as toilet paper. So it's a very costly but hugely valuable piece of intelligence.
Yeah, sounds like you could call it the fruits of the soil heap.
I've got here, it says Ian Whitty comments, so they are.
Sorry.
That's good.
It's a bit of an overstatement there from him. But anyway, so could BRIXMIS go wherever they wanted in East Germany?
Okay. The RMA gave them access to all of East Germany, except for restricted areas. Now, these were called permanent restricted areas, or PRAs, and they covered areas for the Soviets, particular military significance, training areas, troop concentrations, all of the inner German border. So basically in 1952, the East Germans closed off the border between East and West Germany, and that was a PRA throughout the Cold War. But also the Czech border and the Polish border, and a good part of the Baltic coast. The BAOR had a similar reciprocal restrictions in Germany. So it was a sort of part of this partnership, if you like, with the Soviets.
And these PRAs evolved over time. They didn't remain fixed during the entire period.
Yeah, they changed, sometimes annually, sometimes every couple of years or so. The two maps on the top left are actually really useful. So those are the official PRA maps from 1978 and 1988. You can see the inner German border, the left-hand side, and that pink shaded areas are the PRAs. That stayed blocked off throughout. But what's interesting is that you see on the left-hand one the Czech border down the bottom, the Polish border on the right-hand side, and the Baltic coast was all restricted. By 1988, these restrictions had started to lift. So I just thought that was a really good contrast to show how dynamic these PRAs were. And you'll see on the easel there, that's another map, a different scale map with this section showed in. I took that off the wall of my office to bring down today.
And there was another type, the TRA.
Temporary restrictions. So if there was a particular activity going on, an exercise or some interesting bit of kit coming in, they'd impose a temporary restriction. That's this excellent map here that I got from the archive here at the National Army Museum. They were hand-drawn onto quite large-scale maps, and you see the little inset there shows you how vague it all was. And of course, these devious mission people exploited that vagueness to the hilt, and they would use the variations to basically, well, make mischief with the Soviets. Yeah, very important. So this is a TRA on the 22nd of May to the 3rd of June 1973, and that's Dresden and Leipzig.
Right, so on that TRA, there's that line running through the middle of it.
Running diagonally.
What's that?
Well, the Soviet interpretation of the RMA was that autobahns through TRAs and also PRAs should not be restricted. I don't believe it was in the RMA, it was there in just interpretation. But what that meant is missions could still drive through the middle. And there's a lovely story of sort of, they're pootling along the autobahn, looking to their left, and there was a full-scale Soviet battle going on, an exercise. And the mission would park up and take a lot of pictures. And the whole idea was that they would take a maximum advantage out of these little loopholes and these variations.
And that sign in picture 5 looks familiar. Hands up how many people have got one of those in their garage or on the wall.
For the benefit of the online audience, a lot of hands have just gone up. Yeah, it was really a rite of passage. If you hadn't nicked a submission restricted sign, you clearly weren't doing your job. There's one upstairs in the photo frame.
Okay, so you described earlier sort of some of the sites they were looking after, but you've got loads more detail in the book there. But let's just go through some of the types and some of the examples of some of the scrapes that people got into and the intelligence scoops.
Okay, so you'll hear the word kit talked about a lot. So kit was the mission's sort of nickname for basically something of interest. So they'd be sitting there in the car, enjoying a nice cup of tea and some chocolate biscuits. Somebody would see something, they shout kit, and then the team would instantly grab the cameras and start looking. Scoops, on the other hand, was something that was very new or very interesting, something that hadn't seen before. As Ian said, the book is packed with this sort of information. The one story I really like, because it's just fun, is the picture on the bottom right there, and that's Staff Sergeant Ken Wyke. Now, he was with a tour with Peter, just doing a rail watch, watching a railway line to see if anything interesting came along. And a Soviet kit train with a load of armoured personnel carriers happened to pootle past at quite a slow rate. Ken jumped out and ran along the train and jumped on this moving train. I don't know how fast it was going, like walking speed, I think, was it? That sort of thing. Jumped up onto the BMP-2, which was a new armoured personnel carrier in East Germany. And the famous story is he happened to have an apple in his pocket. He grabbed the apple and stuffed it over the muzzle of this gun because the West weren't sure of what calibre the gun was. So he shoved this apple there, but what he did actually quite usefully was he held his dictaphone. He was the tour NCO, and he held his dictaphone against the muzzle, which enabled Peter from the car to shoot some pictures which were slightly more accurate in terms of measurement. Ken, I think the Soviets had woken up to what was going on, so Ken leapt down, jumped in the car, and they disappeared off into the sunset. The apple disintegrated over the next couple of days, unfortunately, but we're not going to let sort of reality get in the way of a good story. The intelligence was gained. He stole the muzzle cover as well, which might have helped. But that's just an example of one story. Ken got the British Empire Medal for his exploits. It's one example that I think just encapsulates the mission spirit.
Now, this was the pre-digital age, so BRIXMIS are taking photos onto 35mm film. Later on, they're using video. But with the photos, how are they processed and then pushed up the chain?
Well, the tour would use lots and lots of film. They'd take them back to the office in West Berlin, and give them to the special section, which was a sort of code word for the in-house RAF photographic lab. They would then produce black and white prints, enlargements, colour slides, and generally they'd be on the tour officer's desk the morning after that they returned from tour. And then what would happen, the tour officer and the NCO would have his notes, he'd have his dictation. They'd then start to plough through all this information, and then if anything interesting came up, they grab their colleagues from the weapons office or the research office, and they'd all sit there with magnifying glasses and looking at the information. So that was the first interpretation of their intelligence product.
Were we sharing this with our NATO allies, or did we just keep this to ourselves?
Well, as soon as they got back, they did something called a tour highlights form, which was actually a very good idea. It was supposed to be the sort of the immediate recollections, the raw recollections of what they saw, any incidents, because if there was an incident on tour, that was likely to catch up with them. So it was pretty good to actually tell the chain of command what had gone on, and copies would go to the US and the French missions as well, and ideally the reports would come back as well. So they were getting a picture of what was going on. Yeah.
Now, something that I know is popular with my listeners is descriptions of some of the special equipment that BRIXMIS had.
Yeah. So we talk about kit in the Soviet sense, but Soviet equipment sense, but kit in terms of the equipment the tour used. This gets a lot of interest because it's fascinating what they got up to. So I'd say there were two fundamental pieces of equipment. One is the tour car, the other is the camera. So the tour car had to take, and of course, as Ian said, there's one upstairs. So if you haven't seen it in the photo friend, please go and have a look, because it's only here till the end of September, I think it is. So the tour car had to take 3 people, as we've talked about, in reasonable comfort with all their equipment for possibly 3, 4, even 5 days. It had to have excellent performance on the road, but also off-road. It had to be a stable photographic platform, but it was also an office and temporary home for the duration of the tour. Tour cars were carefully selected, extensively modified, lovingly maintained, driven harder than you would be allowed to drive a vehicle anywhere else in the British military. And as Ian said, it's much less like motoring, more like rally driving.
Now, this sounds like expensive stuff, and the British military are not notable for their generous budgets.
No, that's very true. That's a very important point, actually. There was something called the occupation budget. So as part of the negotiations at the end of the Second World War, the West German government was obliged to give the Western governments considerable amounts of money to, in effect, fund the occupation. It was administered by the West Berlin Senate, and so BRIXMIS didn't have to go through all the procurement loops and hoops that the other military operations had to. They could bypass procurement, they could deal direct with the manufacturers, and could basically afford the best equipment on the market.
So let's go through these cars that we've got up on the screen now. I'm sure some of you will have your own favourites, particularly the drivers.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots in the book about vehicles, as I'm sure you can imagine. They were primarily Opels, which is the sort of the European equivalent to Vauxhall, and also Mercedes towards the end of the life. The Opel Capitan was adopted in the early 50s, and then there were admirals in the 60s, and finally senators in the 70s. So they followed the model progression of these vehicles. What you see on the 2 left pictures, the top one is an Opel Capitan from 1963.
Yeah, and that sort of shows the somewhat schizophrenic nature of BRIXMIS. Nice shiny car,
yeah.
Somebody in their number 1 uniform.
Absolutely.
Versus broken down car,
Yeah.
covered in mud in a field.
And that's the daily paradox, shall we say. So yeah, that's a huge point. The other thing is that these early cars weren't 4x4s. They were 2-wheel drive cars. And the way they did that was, the way they managed, as you can see the environment that they were driving in, they had quite powerful engines for their time, good tyres, that was a fundamental thing, good Western fuel. The fuel in East Germany was really low octane and couldn't run as fast. And the underbodies were heavily armoured by what were called panzer plates. It added a huge weight to the vehicle, but it had the power or kinetic power to basically ride over rough terrain. Then in the middle there, you've got the Opel Senator, which was introduced in the 1980s, and that's obviously the one upstairs.
And were these vehicles standard models then? They had modifications to
Yeah.
help them with rough terrain.
Heavily modified. So we talked about the Panzer plates that can be seen, underneath the cars. Half a ton extra weight was added to the all-up weight of the vehicle. They had long-range fuel tanks, and you can see that on the Senator upstairs. And there were various other mods specific to the touring requirements. The game changer, though, was something called the Ferguson Formula four-wheel drive conversion. So in the mid-70s, there was a heavy engineering solution that turned this two-wheel drive Opel Senator and Admiral executive saloon into a 4x4 off-road monster. And you saw the picture earlier of the Senator blasting through a ploughed field. Well, this conversion allowed the car to perform completely not as the designers intended, shall we say.
Now, we can't cover BRIXMIS vehicles without talking about the James Bond switches.
Nope, it has to be mentioned that basically a custom lighting panel, if you go upstairs and peer between the front seats, you'll see a custom panel, and that allowed individual control of all the lights. They could go darker at the flick of a switch for the driver driving along with night vision goggles, which must have been a horrendous experience for the passenger. That you could mimic a motorcycle or a Trabant, various things. It was a huge advantage, tactical advantage. The Range Rover, as you can see in the bottom picture there, came along around the same time, albeit it was a three-door only, very capable off-road, but unfortunately it was a product of the 1970s British motor industry.
Yeah, not Britain's finest hour there at all.
Yeah, the less said about that, the better. And we have just to illustrate the point, a broken down Range Rover on a recovery trailer towed by a German Mercedes G-Wagen. One of my favourite stories that I picked up in the archive was a Range Rover on a recovery trailer being towed by another vehicle. There was a BBC crew filming a documentary on J.S. Bach in his hometown, and they bumped into the BRIXMIS. And one of the BBC guys looked at this sort of trailer thing. Tell me, do you always carry a spare car? So it's one of my favourite stories. If it's not true, it doesn't matter. It's too good a story.
Yeah, who cares? Now, even with four-wheel drive, they must have struggled and got bogged down. How was that dealt with?
Well, getting bogged in was a regular occurrence. The vehicles also simply broke down. They were immobilised in basically a contact with the opposition. And there was also the distinct possibility of a road traffic accident. It happened. So we have a lovely picture at the top there with an Opel Senator with Staff Sergeant John Jones and Corporal Robbie Woods, with the Senator in a very deep hole in one of these tack routes I mentioned earlier. Picture was taken by Peter in 1982. But there was a whole host of techniques they used to get themselves out of, and I talk about that in the book.
Now, at the risk of starting a fight within the audience here, in your opinion, what was the best touring vehicle?
Die-hard saloon aficionados will argue the Senator was the ultimate car, but really, if you look at the Mercedes G-Wagen, that you can see there's Squadron Leader Andrew Pennington lounging on the bonnet of a G-Wagen. It had huge advantages. It had excellent four-wheel drive, amazing off-road performance, pretty good on-road performance, not as good as the Senator, but it had four doors. That's a pretty big advantage over the Range Rover. And also it had a lot more space, electric winch in the bumper to help get out of trouble. And yeah, I think that probably was a big step forward, so much so that the British introduced it. Dave in the audience was involved in the selection of this vehicle, but also the Americans used it and the French used it as well.
Now, we mentioned earlier that a key aspect of this was getting good photos. Without that, there's very little intelligence you're going to get back. How was that achieved?
Well, tour officers had to become, in effect, professional photographers with professional equipment and a professional lab back at the office. There were lots of special techniques, both in shooting and processing the film afterwards, and they used a succession of models. Got a photo there on the top left. That's Flight Lieutenant Hugh Maddock-Jones, and we've got his family here in the audience. And he's holding a Leica. That's from 1958. We've got various successions of cameras there. There's a an air tour there at the middle with a officer using a pistol grip holding a rather huge lens, and the tour NCO looking through binoculars, and they'd be calling out information, and as well as maintaining security, the driver would be noting down film numbers, frame numbers in his notebook as well, to sort of get all the information together. The East German optic industry was actually quite good, so a lot of the equipment, certainly binoculars, were locally produced equipment. And then they moved to Nikon, and Rod in the audience here was involved in selecting Nikon as the new camera. He went to the photographic show in 1971, chatted up the Nikon people on the stand, and came away with the Nikon F2 that basically started a relationship with Nikon throughout the life of the mission. The other pictures there, this is actually upstairs. It's not in the photo friend, it's in the...
War in Europe, I think.
Yeah, so we found it yesterday. That's a Nikon F3 body with a motor drive and a mirror lens on the front. I think it's a 500mm mirror lens. Now, this mirror lens was a massive advantage for the mission. They were developed, interestingly, by the Soviets, who packed a sequence of mirrors into a very compact format. So you could have a 500mm or 1000mm, a metre long focal length lens in a very small package. Another good story, so it was developed by the Russians. They produced this MTO lens. The British military attaché in the embassy at Moscow was sent out to buy one of these. It was flown back in the diplomatic pouch to London, flown out to West Berlin, given to the mission, and then used to photograph Soviets. So sort of like a virtuous circle there.
Brilliant. One of the many great BRIXMIS stories. Now, I'm getting hungry. It's getting towards lunchtime. How did BRIXMIS survive when they were out? Because they were staying out overnight. They had to eat. How did that work?
Okay. They initially used hotels, but there was a security issue with that. And so really in the late 1950s, when the anti-mission activity started to ramp up, they began camping out. So the tour officer and the tour NCO always slept outside, whatever the weather, whatever the temperatures, while the driver stayed inside the car with the doors locked, and basically to keep the contents, the secret stuff, secure. The camping spots, they were carefully selected. They were known as Z-platzes, and often they were quite close to the objective. So the idea was you get up and then get on with looking at the target. The invention of the one-man Gore-Tex pop-up tent was a bit of another revelation. There's some diehards in the audience who'd insist on using a more traditional bivvy approach, but this Gore-Tex tent was actually a major innovation.
Yeah, I was going to say the chap in picture one doesn't seem too happy about the arrangement.
No, that's Mr. Pennington sat in the audience there. But the idea was you'd better get your tent up, get in your sleeping bag in the dark, in any conditions, in less than a couple of minutes. That was the whole idea. Yeah,
and eating. I mean, how was that handled?
Well, to start with, they would bring packed lunches, but if they were stationary for any period of time, they would cook. And we've got Corporal Wayne Fury there grilling a sausage over a Primus stove, which apparently was one of his things. We then have, on tour, East German cakes were supposed to be very good, and ice creams were very good. However, after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, word came down from on high that the East German dairy industry had to be avoided because for genuine fears of contamination. So no cakes, I'm afraid, for tourers.
And is that one of the famous BRIXMIS curries being cooked in that?
That's part of a BRIXMIS tradition, and you'll see that's on the screen there being cooked actually inside a Mercedes G-Wagen. Everybody would contribute ingredients. They'd all go in the pot, all sorts of wondrous things. Woe betide if any tour member was a vegetarian. That caused no end of problems. And then lastly, we've got another picture of Andrew Pennington boiling the water for the thermos flasks. And this was, again, part of a BRIXMIS ritual. In the morning, they would boil the water, stick it in flasks, and then every 2 hours, without fail, they would stop for a brew. It was either that or get in extreme trouble from the tour driver. So, again, a part of BRIXMIS tradition that was drummed in at the trading.
Now, one thing we haven't covered is the opposition, and there was serious opposition to BRIXMIS in East Germany.
Absolutely. Well, basically, first, the opposition had to catch the tour. So there are some extraordinary hair-raising tales of evasion. I've got some really quite, jaw-dropping stories in the book of basically high-intensity car chases. The opposition was primarily the Soviet forces in Germany, the NVA, which was the East German military, and of course the Stasi, the infamous secret police. The East Germans had no powers to arrest or detain the Tours, but they could certainly interrupt their day, they could intercept them, and with various degrees of violence, they could try and stop the Tour. They would then hand them over to the Soviets to do the necessary paperwork. Ramming was pretty commonplace, sometimes in deliberate ambushes. Shots were sometimes fired, occasionally, and unfortunately, some of them even hit their targets. So this is a very quick run through these pictures here. From the 1950s, you see a very bit of overt surveillance going there with some Stasi narcs literally parked a couple of 100 feet behind a tour car, which is having its wheel changed. There's an incident in the 60s, there's a Soviet sentry firing at a mission there. That was Frank White, who was getting a little bit too close for comfort. In 1976, there was a pretty nasty ramming incident. There's a tour led by a guy called Major Gordon Duff, and the vehicle was forced off the road by two Stasi motorbikes and then rammed by a 4.5-ton NVA truck. The tour NCO, Sergeant Bob Thomas, was really quite badly injured, had a badly broken leg, and then had a rather uncomfortable stay in an East German hospital after that. We talked about the Stasi reports. Well, there's a lot of stolen equipment there. There's some night vision goggles and various other sneaky-beaky bits of equipment. At the top there, you've got Staff Sergeant Graham Geary practicing diplomatic restraint in the face of some Soviet aggression there. And then there's the Athenstedt incident. If you heard Peter's talk here some months ago, he recounted this incident, but basically Brigadier John Learmont, it was an attempt to basically kill a mission member by the East Germans, and there was a really violent ramming by a 12-ton truck.
Yeah. That talk's available on the museum's YouTube channel if anybody wants to see it.
And I sort of go into some detail about it in the book. And then lastly, we've got Captain Stephen Harrison on tour with Eddie Fannon and the driver Mick Rostron. They were driving a G-Wagen, and basically they were being chased in reverse by a GRU Spetsnaz squad in a BRDM-2, an armoured personnel carrier. So basically they were in reverse at high speed being chased down. Rostron did this J-turn, a moving turn, and basically carried on with his momentum forwards, and they escaped. And the guy you can see with the machine pistol there basically fired at the Tour, and thankfully they missed. So that was a...
Yeah, Stephen Harrison gives a very vivid description of that in my episode 250 in Cold War Conversations. That's the last promo for today.
I would highly recommend this podcast.
So there seems to be many close scrapes with death, but there were fatalities in the other mission teams.
Absolutely, and it's important we sort of reflect on that today. There were some very serious incidents really going back to the 1960s. In March 1962, there was a tour out in the GDR, but quite close to the Berlin Wall. The driver was a Corporal Day, and basically a East German border guard, a Grepo, came out of this sort of guard post and emptied the magazine of his automatic rifle into the back of the car. Now, the tour officer, who was actually, I think, MI6 at the time, but he survived. He got away scot-free. Day was hit multiple times. Thankfully, he survived, though. We've got the Athenstedt incident we talked about. That was a direct attempt to kill a mission member who actually happened to be Chief BRIXMIS at the time, and Peter. And then, unfortunately, in March 1984, there was the first fatality. And Adjutant Chef Philippe Mariotti of the French mission was killed in a horrendous, targeted assassination, and that was in Halle in East Germany. And then the following year, Major Nick Nicholson of the US military liaison mission was shot and killed by a Soviet sentry, and that was in Ludwig-Lust Tekentin. Now, these were very serious incidents, obviously. They caused major diplomatic ructions that hit the White House, hit the Kremlin. It was a really big deal. But what struck me as I researched the book was how random the whole thing was. A tour could be targeted at any moment, anywhere in the GDR. It didn't matter whether they were British, French or American. Every time they crossed the bridge that we saw earlier, they were at risk of being subjected to serious, if not lethal, violence. And that was that was a real sort of revelation to me, just how, go back to Peter's comment about risk and rigour with the medals committee, it was a very serious, dangerous game they played.
Yeah, I think it absolutely underlines how different the BRIXMIS experience was to any other British unit during the Cold War. If a tour was stopped by the East Germans and the Soviets, what then happened?
Okay, so the tour would try to evade. They would be sandwiched, and we see there a Range Rover very unsubtly sandwiched between two armoured personnel cars. That wasn't going anywhere. I read stories of actually the Soviets put landmines in front of the tyres to stop them moving at all. So, it was quite serious. We've got tarping there, which is the top middle, which was actually quite nasty. So they put these very heavy tarpaulins over the vehicle. And on a hot day, with the windows probably up for security, that was a very unpleasant situation. And then, of course, you've got ramming. There's an incident there where a G-Wagen was basically pushed off the road. What you don't see in this picture was to the immediate right, there was a railway track. So they used the situation very, very aggressively. The East Germans, as we said earlier, had no authority. So they basically summoned the local commandant who would investigate, he'd interview the witnesses, he'd take photos, measurements, all that sort of stuff. And then there's a lovely photo there of Captain Stephen Harrison, appears on one of Ian's episodes, trying to talk his way out of a situation. And that demonstrates how important Russian language skills were, because you could potentially talk yourself out of a problem. We've got Squadron Leader Martin Kommen there in discussion with an East German and Soviet officer, pointedly photographed right next to a MRS sign. I think it was a rather deliberate on the Stasi's part. And then we have the commandant laboriously preparing his statement, which was called an act. So he'd produce it, he'd write it, draft it up, sometimes call up the chain for advice and information, and then the tour officer would routinely refuse to sign it. That was their standard operation procedure. And we've got Flight Lieutenant Crawford there in 1982 staring disdainfully at the act that he would then decline to sign.
Now, there's loads more we'd love to tell you about, but we've run out of time. So you're going to have to buy the book. You were going to buy it anyway, but go out and buy the book. Loads more stories, loads more detail. Is there anything else you'd like to say in conclusion, Andrew?
No, I think let's just show you the end of the mission. So obviously all good things come to an end of the Cold War, Berlin Wall opening, basically the mission, the role of the mission became redundant. There was, in theory, no need for it. But you've got some lovely shots there of a group of BRIXMIS veterans on the Glenicke Bridge the day after it opened up, with a load of smelly Trabants in the background. And then finally, I love that photo in the bottom there. It's really poor quality. If anyone's got a better photo, I'd love to have it. That's the last tour, when it was in a forest in the middle of Germany, and as you'll see there, they enjoyed their barbecue right next to an MRS sign again. So that really concludes the talk. It was a fascinating project to write. I think Elite put the last words to a very senior MOD official. He said, BRIXMIS was a unique organisation which operated in a unique period of history, and its products were uniquely valuable. So that really sums up the mission. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ian, for
my pleasure
for talking to me and keeping me on the straight and narrow. And thank you for all the people who contributed and helped me write the book. I look forward to meeting you all and chatting later.
The book is called BRIXMIS, The Secret Cold War, Intelligence Collection Operations Behind Enemy Lines in East Germany. There's a link in the episode notes for you to buy the book and support the podcast. Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road.
The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.